Whether it's blood-sucking monsters on the hunt for human blood, or a teenage boy who sparkles in the sunlight while going to high school, chances are you've heard of vampires. But have you ever stopped and thought, what sparked these tales of these creatures of the night, and who wrote them? Oftentimes now romanticized, vampires have a vast and dark history rooting itself in folklore and folk tales. And in this speech, I will be focusing on three main aspects of literature focusing on vampires. The first being the origins of vampires in literature. The second being vampires in the literature in the 1700s to the 1900s. And finally, more modern day time vampires spanning from the early 2000s till now. When it comes to the origin of the belief of vampires, it really roots itself in folk tales, which were then fueled by mass panic of vampirisms and blood-sucking monsters, which started around the time of the plague, according to History.com, published an article by the name of Vampire History, February 21st, 2020, which entailed some of the first accounts of widespread panic, which would have been an article written entailing what to look out for in vampires and what a vampire was, which would have been like a news article. Think of the New York Times, but smaller scale. But the physical appearance, such as the pale skin, the undead look, the not being able to go out in the sun, was inspired by a poem titled The Vampire by German poet, excuse my pronunciation of the name, Erich August Osterfield, which I got this information from Vampires in Literature Timeline and History, published by Study.com, written by PhD holder Pierre R. in August of 2016. In this article, he also details Vlad the Impaler, who was a real-life person who would oftentimes dip his bread in the blood of his enemies in the battlefield and then consume it, sparking fear in many people. He was also the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 book Dracula. Vlad led to many other legends being told about vampires throughout the ages, such as Dracula, which sparked a fire in media about different vampires and blood-sucking monsters. Literature throughout the 17 and 1900 through the 1900s was littered with tales of these vampires. The story of Dracula, however, is not the only legendary vampire. Marcy Brown, a real person who lived in Rhode Island, United States, was thought to be a vampire, according to History.com, Vampire History, published February 21st, 2020. And her experience, as well as many others, led to a witch hunt of sorts of vampires. And oftentimes, people who are suspected of vampirism will be stabbed in the chest or heart post-mortem. And as well in other parts of the world, they would decapitate them completely and burn the bodies to make sure that these undead creatures stay dead this time. But of course, these are all legends. But you may be asking yourself, how did that aspect of vampirism turn into what I know today, such as Twilight and other things? Well, vampires kind of were washed out of media, not completely, of course, but watered down, where it wasn't as prevalent as it is then and as it is now. What I like to call the Renaissance of vampires started with Stephenie Meyer's book Twilight, which was later adapted into films, which focuses on a teen boy named Edward and a teenage girl named Bella. And this was very popular and still is very popular with young adults and teens today, selling over 1.3 million copies of the final book in the series, Breaking Dawn, within the first hour of being sold, according to a Bozeman article in New York Times titled Big Sale of Twilight published August 5th, 2008, after the release of Breaking Dawn, which really sparked the renaissance, as I said, of vampirism in media. Another example of we recognize as the reintroduction of vampires in media would be Vampire Diaries, a very popular TV show with all ages, but mostly focusing on young adults and teens, specifically females. Increased popularity, which then led to 2 spin-offs, The Originals and Legacies, which Legacies is still running today, about different families of vampire. Another more recent example of vampires in media, which you may not have heard of, you may have, really depends on if you're a reader or not, would be From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This focuses on vampires in a less obvious light. It is a vampire story, although it takes a twist on it. It was also voted Goodreads 2020 Best Romance Book of the Year with over 70,000 votes, according to Goodreads.com. When it comes to when it comes to the romanticism of vampires, it's a quote by from an article by Gross, titled From Dracula to Edward, Changing the Face of Vampires, published by CNN, sponsored by CNN, November 18th, 2009, reads as stated. I do not sense the returning of vampires coming back, he said. I think people are tired of the castrated vampires, but that trend tends to be in adults 18 up, rather than students who are reading Twilight in high school and considering it the apex of romantic fiction, end quote. Another beautiful example of this would be the quote by Kristen Stewart in Twilight, the movie, when it was adapted into a movie. One of the most famous quotes would be, "There are 3 things I'm absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was uncontrollably and irrevocably in love with him." That was a quote from the Twilight movie. Vampires have always been very popular throughout the ages in media, whether it's the fear or the lust of them. Chances are you've heard something about them, and I hope this presentation helped you learn a little bit more and gain some insight on the origins and the rebirth of vampires through media, as I covered the origins of vampire in literature, then focused on vampires from the 17 to 1800s in media, and finally landed on vampires in media in modern day time. Thank you.